Why do people slowly fade from your life, even when nothing went wrong? Strangely, distance doesn't begin with conflict. It begins with quiet adjustments you barely notice, small changes, repeated, until connection thins out without a clear reason. And by the time you feel it, it already feels normal. It rarely starts with something obvious. No dramatic fallout, no clear rejection, just small, almost invisible shifts in how you move through people. The kind of changes that feel like maturity or self-protection or simply being low maintenance. But underneath that surface, something else is happening, and most people don't notice it until the silence around them becomes louder than any conflict ever was. One of the first shifts often feels like control. You begin choosing when and how to engage with others more carefully. You respond when it's convenient. You keep conversations short, efficient, contained. It feels like you're managing your energy, which sounds reasonable. But what most people don't realize is that connection isn't built in efficiency. It's built in excess, extra time, extra curiosity, extra presence. When you remove the excess, you don't damage the relationship immediately, but you stop feeding it. And something unfed doesn't collapse overnight. It slowly thins out. Then there's the habit of pre-deciding how others will respond to you. You start editing yourself before you even speak. Not because anyone told you to, but because you have already imagined the outcome. You assume what they'll think, how they'll react, what parts of you are too much or not worth sharing. So you filter. And the strange part is, people don't notice what you hide. They only feel what's missing. Conversations become flatter, interactions become predictable, and without realizing it, you've made yourself easier to be around, but harder to actually know. And that's where something subtle begins to fracture. Because being known requires risk, not dramatic vulnerability, not emotional oversharing, just the willingness to exist without full control of perception. But if every version of you that reaches others has already been softened, adjusted, and approved internally, then they're not meeting you. They're meeting a version designed to avoid friction. And over time, people don't push against that version. They simply stop leaning in. Another behavior hides behind something that looks like strength. You stop asking for help, not because you don't need it, but because you've trained yourself to function without it. You handle your own problems, process your own emotions, carry your own weight. It feels independent, even admirable. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about. When you remove the need for others, you also remove their role in your life. And without a role, people don't feel connected, they feel optional. And when someone feels optional long enough, they begin to act that way. But that's not the real reason distance grows. There's also the way you start minimizing moments. You don't share small updates anymore. You don't send random thoughts. You don't invite people into the ordinary parts of your day. It feels unnecessary. Why tell someone what you had for lunch, or what you're thinking about late at night, or what made you pause for a second during the day? It seems trivial. But connection is built almost entirely out of what looks trivial. When you remove those moments, interactions become transactional, only happening when there's something important to say. And the problem is, important things are rare, so silence fills the space instead. At some point, you also begin to disappear in a more subtle way. You're still present, technically. You reply, you show up, you maintain the outline of connection. But internally, you're less engaged. You listen, but you don't fully enter the conversation. You respond, but you don't extend it. You exist near people, not with them. And because nothing is visibly wrong, no one questions it. But over time, the absence of depth creates a quiet discomfort. Not enough to confront, just enough to drift. And then there's the shift in how you interpret others. You start assuming distance before it's even there. A delayed reply feels intentional. A short message feels dismissive. A change in tone feels like withdrawal. So you adjust accordingly. You match the energy, you pull back slightly, you protect yourself preemptively. But what most people don't realize is that this creates the very pattern they're trying to avoid. Because the other person isn't reacting to your thoughts. They're reacting to your behavior. And your behavior has already begun to withdraw. It becomes a loop, quiet, unspoken, almost invisible. But it doesn't stop there. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. You also begin to value peace over connection. You avoid difficult conversations, not because you're afraid, but because you don't see the point. You tell yourself it's better to let things go, to not complicate things, to keep interactions smooth, and in the moment, that works. There's no tension, no discomfort. But what most people don't realize is that tension is part of connection, not constant tension, but the willingness to disrupt the surface when something real needs to be said. Without that, everything stays polite and distant. And somewhere along the way, you start convincing yourself that you're simply different, that most people don't understand you, that your way of thinking, feeling, or experiencing things doesn't align with others. It feels like clarity, like self-awareness, but it also creates separation, because once you believe you're fundamentally different, you stop trying to be understood. And when you stop trying, people stop trying too. And that's where something deeper begins to form, because none of these behaviors feel like isolation while they're happening. They feel like control, like maturity, like self-respect, like independence. And in some ways, they are. But what most people don't realize is that isolation rarely comes from being rejected. It comes from slowly removing the conditions that allow connection to exist. And by the time you notice it, it doesn't feel like something you did. It feels like something that just happened. But that's only the surface layer, because underneath these behaviors, there's a quieter mechanism shaping all of it. Something less visible but far more consistent, and that's where it starts to become uncomfortable. There's another pattern that rarely gets noticed because it feels like emotional stability. You stop reacting, not in a loud, obvious way, but in the subtle sense that fewer things move you. You don't get as excited, you don't get as disappointed, you don't lean too far in either direction. It feels balanced, controlled. But what most people don't realize is that connection feeds on visible reaction, not exaggerated emotion, just enough presence to show that something inside you is responding. And when that response fades, people don't always interpret it as strength. They interpret it as distance, and that distance becomes harder to name because nothing is technically wrong. You're not cold, you're not rude, you're just neutral. Consistently neutral. And over time, that neutrality creates a kind of emotional silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind where people stop reaching because they're not sure what they'll find when they do. Another behavior hides behind the idea of not wanting to be a burden. You start withholding things, not just problems, but thoughts, opinions, reactions. You tell yourself it's better to keep things light, to not complicate other people's lives with your internal world. It feels considerate, almost kind. But what most people don't realize is that relationships aren't built on convenience. They're built on shared weight. And when you remove your weight completely, you don't make the connection easier, you make it thinner. And that's where something subtle begins to shift in how others experience you. They don't feel needed, not in a dependent way, but in a human way. The kind where their presence matters, where their response changes something, where their involvement has weight. Without that, Interactions start to feel optional on both sides, and optional things are easy to delay, easy to forget, easy to let drift. But that's not the only layer. There's also the way you start closing conversations before they fully open. Someone reaches out and you respond, but you don't extend. You answer, but you don't ask. You acknowledge, but you don't explore. It feels efficient, even respectful of time. But what most people don't realize is that conversations don't grow from answers. They grow from curiosity. And when curiosity disappears, conversations lose their depth without anyone pointing it out. Over time, people begin to match your rhythm, not consciously, just naturally. They mirror your level of engagement, your level of openness, your level of presence. And because you've slowly reduced those things, they do too. Not out of disinterest, but out of alignment. And that's where the illusion forms. It starts to feel like they're the ones pulling away, like they've become distant, less invested, less present. But what's actually happening is quieter than that. They're adjusting to the version of you that no longer invites depth. And then there's the habit of staying in your head during interactions. You listen, but you're also analyzing. You're tracking tone, meaning, subtext. You're thinking about how to respond, how you're being perceived, what this moment means long term. It feels like awareness. But what most people don't realize is that connection happens in participation, not observation. And when too much of you stays in observation mode, only a fraction of you actually shows up. People feel that, even if they can't explain it. They feel the gap between your presence and your attention. And that gap slowly widens. Another behavior that slips in quietly is the avoidance of initiating. You don't reach out first. Not because you don't care, but because you don't want to impose or seem needy or disrupt someone else's space. So you wait. You respond when others initiate, you maintain when it's offered, but you rarely create the moment yourself. And what most people don't realize is that initiation is a signal. It tells someone they're on your mind without needing a reason. Without it, connection becomes reactive instead of alive. And reactive connections don't grow. They maintain at best and fade at worst. But that's still not the deepest part. There's also the way you begin to compress your identity into something easier to carry. You simplify yourself in social spaces. You present the parts that are easiest to explain, easiest to accept, easiest to move through quickly. And you keep the rest internal, not hidden out of fear, but set aside out of habit. Over time, this creates a strange imbalance. You're fully present in your own world, but partially present in shared spaces. And people don't reject what they don't see. They simply never connect with it. And that's where something almost unnoticeable begins to settle in. A quiet form of disconnection that doesn't feel like loss, just less. Less depth, less pull, less presence. And because it happens gradually, it doesn't trigger alarm. It doesn't feel like something breaking. It feels like something stabilizing, like things are simply becoming calmer, quieter, more controlled. But what most people don't realize is that control and connection often move in opposite directions. The more controlled your presence becomes, the less space there is for unpredictability. And unpredictability is where most real connection lives. Without it, everything becomes safe. And safe, over time, becomes distant. By now, the pattern is already forming, not through one behavior, not through one moment, but through accumulation. Small choices, repeated, reinforced, until they begin to define how you exist around others. And at that point, the question isn't whether you're isolating yourself, it's whether you even recognize the process while it's happening. Because beneath all of these behaviors, there's something else shaping them, something quieter, something more internal, not habits, but the reason those habits feel necessary in the first place. And that's where it starts to turn inward. What makes these behaviors difficult to recognize is that they don't come from nowhere. They aren't random habits you picked up by accident. They're responses, quiet adaptations, formed slowly, reinforced over time, until they start to feel like your natural way of being. And that's where it becomes uncomfortable, because the distance you're experiencing now isn't just something happening around you. It's something that was shaped within you, long before it became visible in your relationships. It often begins with a shift in trust, not the obvious kind, where something breaks and you clearly remember why, but the quieter version, the kind that forms when your experiences teach you that being fully present with others doesn't always lead to something stable. So instead of pulling away dramatically, you recalibrate. You stay connected, but not fully. You engage, but with boundaries that no one else can see. What most people don't realize is that this kind of partial presence feels safe, but it also fragments connection. Because connection doesn't respond to what you intend. It responds to what you allow. And what you allow has already been reduced. There's also a deeper tension that rarely gets named, a kind of internal contradiction. You want connection, but you also want control over how that connection affects you. You want to be understood, but without the risk of being misinterpreted. You want closeness, but without the unpredictability that comes with it. And the problem is, those things don't coexist easily. So your mind begins to resolve the conflict in the only way it knows how, by reducing exposure. Not eliminating connection entirely, just lowering the intensity, keeping everything within a range that feels manageable. But that's not the real issue, because the real issue isn't that you're protecting yourself. It's what you're protecting yourself from. There's often a quiet memory behind it, not always one clear event. Sometimes just a pattern. Moments where being open didn't lead to understanding, where expressing something real didn't land the way you expected, where parts of you felt overlooked, misread, or simply unnecessary. And instead of confronting those moments directly, you adjust around them. You learn what to keep, what to soften, what to leave out entirely. Over time, this becomes automatic, and that's where something subtle but important shifts. You stop approaching people as they are, and start approaching them through the filter of what might go wrong. Even when nothing is happening, even when the moment is neutral. Because your attention is no longer in the interaction itself. It's in the possibility of misalignment, and that changes everything. It changes how you speak, how you listen, how long you stay in a moment before pulling back internally. And because all of this happens quietly, no one sees the adjustment. They just feel the distance. Another layer forms around the idea of self-sufficiency. You begin to rely on yourself not just out of necessity, but as a default. It feels stable, predictable. You know how to manage your own thoughts, your own emotions, your own responses. But what most people don't realize is that self-sufficiency, when it becomes complete, removes the need for external input. And without need, connection loses its function. Not emotionally, but structurally. Because relationships are not just built on presence. They're built on exchange, influence, impact, the sense that something about the other person actually affects you. And when you've trained yourself to remain unaffected, even in subtle ways, that exchange begins to weaken. But that's still not the deepest part. There's also the way you begin to interpret your own restraint. You don't see it as avoidance. You see it as clarity, as knowing who you are, what you want, what you don't tolerate. And in many ways, that's true. But what most people don't realize is that clarity can sometimes become a boundary that's too complete. So complete that nothing new gets through. Not new perspectives, not unexpected connections, not even the possibility of being changed by someone else. And when nothing gets through, nothing grows. So the distance isn't just between you and others. It's between you and any version of connection that requires uncertainty. And that's where it starts to tighten. Because now it's no longer just about behavior. It's about identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who is independent, self-contained, not easily influenced. And while that can feel grounding, it also makes it harder to recognize when independence has quietly turned into isolation. Because isolation at this level doesn't feel like absence. It feels like stability, like nothing is missing, because nothing is expected. But that's not entirely true. There's still a part of you that notices, not loudly, not urgently, just in small, almost forgettable moments. When a conversation ends and something feels incomplete, but you can't explain why. When you're around people and everything is fine, but nothing lingers afterward. When connection exists, but doesn't leave an impression. And that's where it begins to feel different. Not painful enough to fix, but not fulfilling enough to ignore. And that quiet space in between is where most people stay, because moving out of it would require something unfamiliar, not more control, but less, not more certainty, but exposure. And that's where the real conflict starts to surface. And that conflict doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't announce itself in obvious ways. It settles quietly into your decisions, shaping them from underneath. You begin to choose the version of connection that asks the least from you. Not because you don't care, but because something in you has learned that caring too openly creates instability. So you create a version of closeness that feels controlled, predictable conversations, measured presence, care that stays within safe limits. And on the surface, it works. Nothing collapses, nothing breaks. But what most people don't realize is that when connection is built on limitation, it stops evolving. It becomes something you maintain, not something you experience. And over time, maintenance starts to feel like distance. There's also a deeper discomfort that rarely gets named. The discomfort of being seen in a way you can't manage. Because once someone starts to understand you beyond what you've chosen to show, you lose a certain kind of control. They begin to notice patterns, contradictions, unspoken things, and that awareness can feel intrusive, even when it's not meant to be. So without fully realizing it, you keep people at a level where they can interact with you, but not fully read you. And that's where something starts to fracture. Because connection doesn't deepen through interaction alone. It deepens through recognition. The moment someone sees something in you that you didn't explain, and stays. But if no one ever reaches that point, because you've structured yourself to prevent it, then connection remains surface level, no matter how long it exists. But that's still not the core of it. There's a quieter fear underneath all of this. Not the fear of rejection, but the fear of irrelevance. The possibility that if you show more of yourself, it might not change anything. That it might not be received, not be valued, not be understood in a way that matters. And instead of confronting that possibility directly, you avoid creating it at all. You stay within a version of yourself that guarantees stability, even if it limits depth. And that's where the pattern becomes self-sustaining. Because now, it's not just about protecting yourself from others. It's about protecting yourself from outcomes you've already imagined. You begin to interact less with reality and more with expectation. You assume how things will unfold, how people will respond, how connection will feel, and you adjust before the moment even has a chance to prove you wrong. And that adjustment removes something essential, not opportunity, but unpredictability. And without unpredictability, connection becomes flat. Not bad, not negative, just flat. And flatness is difficult to challenge because it doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't demand change. It simply continues, quietly reinforcing itself. There's also the way time starts to play into this. The longer you operate within these patterns, the more they feel natural. Not like something you're doing, but something you are. And once something becomes part of your identity, it's no longer questioned. You don't notice the moments you hold back, because holding back feels like your default. You don't notice the absence of depth, because shallow consistency feels stable. You don't notice the distance because you've adapted to it. And that's where the real tension exists, not in what's happening externally, but in what's no longer being felt internally, because connection, when it's alive, leaves an imprint. It lingers, it shifts something in you, it creates movement, subtle, but real. But when you've reduced your exposure to that kind of movement, everything begins to feel the same. Interactions blur together. People become interchangeable. Moments pass without weight, and that sameness starts to feel normal. But underneath it, something is missing. Not in a way that's easy to name, but in a way that slowly changes how you experience everything. You stop expecting depth. You stop looking for it. You stop believing it's something that happens naturally. And once that belief fades, the behaviors that created the distance feel justified. They feel necessary. Because from your perspective, you're not isolating yourself. You're simply operating within a reality that no longer offers anything deeper. But that perception is shaped by the very patterns that created it. And that's where it becomes difficult to see clearly. Because now the cause and the effect have blended together. You feel disconnected, so you hold back. You hold back, so connection becomes limited. Connection becomes limited, so it confirms your expectation, and the loop continues, quietly, consistently, until isolation no longer feels like a change, but a baseline. And at that point, the question isn't why people feel distant. It's whether you still remember what closeness felt like before all of this began. Because somewhere beneath the control, the restraint, the quiet adjustments, there's still a part of you that recognizes the difference. Not as a memory, but as a contrast. A sense that something about the way you connect now is missing a layer that used to exist. And that awareness, however faint, is where everything begins to shift. Not because it solves anything, but because it interrupts the pattern just enough to make you see it. And once you can see it, you can't experience it the same way again, which raises a different kind of question. Not how to fix it, but whether you're willing to move differently, even without certainty. The shift doesn't begin with doing more. It begins with noticing what you've been quietly removing. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just small moments where you choose not to reduce yourself, because the instinct to control connection doesn't disappear just because you understand it. It's still there, in how you respond, how you hold back, how you anticipate outcomes before they happen. So the change isn't about eliminating that instinct. It's about interrupting it, gently, at the level where it actually operates. For example, the next time you feel the urge to end a conversation once the necessary part is over, don't extend it with effort. Just don't close it so quickly. Let it sit for a second longer than feels natural. Not to force depth, but to stop cutting it off before it has a chance to become something else. And that might feel insignificant, But what most people don't realize is that connection doesn't grow from big gestures. It grows from the moments that were almost dismissed, but weren't. There's also a different kind of shift that happens internally. Instead of preparing for how an interaction might go, you begin to allow it to unfold without rehearsal. Not perfectly, just slightly less controlled. Because the problem was never that you were thinking too much, it's that your thinking replaced participation. So the change isn't to stop thinking. It's to let thinking come after the moment, not before it. And that creates a subtle difference in how you show up. You respond a little less strategically. You listen without immediately translating everything into meaning. You allow small uncertainties to exist without resolving them instantly. And at first, that can feel uncomfortable. Not because anything is wrong, but because you're no longer managing the outcome as tightly. But that's where something begins to open. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to let unpredictability return. Another shift begins with something even quieter, allowing yourself to be slightly inconvenient. Not in a disruptive way, just in a human way. Sharing something that doesn't need to be shared. Expressing a thought that isn't fully refined. Letting a reaction exist without softening it first. Because when you've spent so much time being easy to be around, you forget that being known requires a certain level of friction, not conflict, just reality. And reality isn't always smooth. At first, this might feel unnecessary, even uncomfortable. You might question why you're saying more or showing more when everything was already functioning fine. But that's the point. It was functioning, not necessarily connecting, and those are not the same thing. There's also a change in how you relate to silence. Before, silence may have felt neutral, even peaceful, but now you begin to notice what kind of silence it is. Is it shared, or is it empty? Because shared silence still carries presence. It doesn't feel like distance. It feels like space that belongs to both people. Empty silence, on the other hand, feels like something has been removed. And once you start noticing that difference, your interactions begin to shift naturally. Not because you're trying to fix anything, but because you're no longer mistaking absence for calm. Another subtle shift happens in how you approach initiation. Instead of waiting for a reason, you allow moments to exist without justification. You reach out without a purpose. You speak without needing a topic. You enter a conversation without knowing where it will go. And that might feel unfamiliar, because for a long time, everything had a reason, a structure, a clear entry and exit. But connection doesn't always follow structure. It often begins in randomness, and when you remove the need for things to make sense before they happen, you create space for something else to form, something less controlled, but more alive. And then there's the part that feels the most subtle, but changes everything. You stop trying to preserve the version of yourself that feels stable, not by losing it, but by allowing it to be incomplete. Because the version of you that feels consistent, predictable, self-contained, was built to avoid disruption. But disruption is where depth enters. Not chaos, just the kind of movement that reminds you that something is actually happening between you and someone else. And when you allow that movement back in, even in small ways, connection starts to feel different, less managed, less rehearsed, less filtered. And, because of that, more real. But this doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes deep or meaningful. That's not how it works. What changes first is the texture. And the feeling you once thought was normal starts to feel unfamiliar. Not in a bad way, just different. Less controlled, less predictable, less distant. And maybe that's where it changes. Not when everything becomes deep or meaningful, but when it no longer feels like you're watching your own life from a slight distance, when moments begin to leave an impression again, when people feel less like passing interactions and more like something that stays even after they're gone. And that doesn't come from doing more, it comes from removing less, from allowing what's already there to actually exist, without editing it down to something safer. So if any part of this felt familiar, not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet sense of recognition you couldn't fully explain, then stay with that. Not to fix it, not to change everything at once, just to keep noticing. Because once you start noticing the moments where you almost disappear, you also start noticing the moments where you don't. And that difference, small as it seems, is where everything begins to shift. Not outwardly, but in the way connection starts to feel again. And if you want to keep exploring that shift, not as advice, but as something you can observe in real time, there are more layers to this than it first appears. Not obvious ones, but the kind that only become clear once you start paying attention to what you used to overlook.